On the night of October 22nd, 1883, two opera houses opened in New York within an hour of each other. They stood about 25 blocks apart. One was old, exclusive, and almost impossible to enter. The other was brand new, and it had been built out of pure spite. The old house was the Academy of Music, the private clubhouse of the families who had run the city for generations. The new house was the Metropolitan Opera. It belonged to men who had more money than anyone alive, and who still could not buy their way past the door. That is the part that stays with me. Of all the Gilded Age fortunes I have read about, this is the only case where the richest man in America offered cash for the one thing he wanted, and was told flatly no. So he did something no one expected. He helped build a rival. What followed was never really about music, it was about power. Who gets to sit where? Who gets seen? Who decides which families matter in the largest city in the country? A velvet box, barely big enough for 6 chairs, became the prize in a war between old blood and new money. By the end, one of those two houses would be gone. The other would stand for more than 80 years, survive a fire that gutted it from the inside, and then meet an ending that still makes people in New York angry today. This is the story of how a theater redrew the map of who ran the city, and of the people willing to spend a fortune simply to be looked at. Chapter 1: The Snub. To understand why grown men with railroads and banks went to war over an opera house, you have to start with a single number: 18. That was how many private boxes lined the curve of the Academy of Music, the opera house on 14th Street and Irving Place. 18 in a city of more than 1 million people. They held the best sight lines in the building, but the view was never the point. To sit in one was to be told in front of everyone who mattered that you belonged at the very top of New York. The boxes did not come up for sale each season. They moved down inside a small circle of families who had been in the city since before it was American. Old Dutch names, old English names, people whose grandparents had been wealthy back when the Vanderbilts were still working with their hands. A box at the Academy was not a ticket. It was closer to a title, passed from parent to child, and the families who held them saw no reason to share. Then the new fortunes arrived. By the 1870s, a different kind of money was climbing through the city. It came from railroads and steel, from oil and stocks and shipping lines. The men who built these fortunes were richer than the old families had ever imagined being. And they expected what money had bought them everywhere else: standing, a place at the table, a box at the opera. William Henry Vanderbilt sat at the head of that new class. He had taken over a railroad empire from his father, the old Commodore. By most accounts, he was the wealthiest man on earth at the time. In 1880, he set his sights on a box at the Academy. He reportedly offered $30,000 for one, a staggering sum, close to $1 million in today's money, for the right to sit in a small room and watch a performance. The answer was no. There was no box available, he was told, and none would be made available, not for any figure he cared to name. The old families had no interest in his railroad money. They had drawn a line, and he was standing on the wrong side of it, and every dollar in America could not carry him across. I keep coming back to that refusal because it shows exactly how power worked in this city. It was not counted in dollars, it was counted in who would agree to sit beside you. For Vanderbilt and the men around him, a public refusal was a public insult. These were people used to winning. They could buy newspapers and mansions and long stretches of Fifth Avenue. They could not buy 18 boxes that were already accounted for. So a small group of them reached a simple and very expensive decision. If the old families would not open the door, they would stop knocking. They would put up a house of their own instead, something larger, something newer. A building with so many boxes that the Academy would suddenly look like a leftover from another age. Wounded pride was part of it. No one involved would have denied that. But there was cold sense underneath the anger, too. An opera box was never really about the opera. It was the most public stage in the city. The one place where its families showed their rank to one another season after season. Whoever owned that stage held something very close to the social order itself. That was the real prize. The old families believed they had simply shown an upstart the door. In truth, they had picked a fight with the most powerful newcomers the country had ever made. And those newcomers were not going to write an angry letter or sulk in silence. They were going to answer with brick and stone and a stage of their own. Chapter 2: The Counterattack. In the spring of 1880, a couple dozen of the richest men in America met for dinner at Delmonico's, the restaurant where fashionable New York liked to be seen. They were not there for the food. They were there to build a weapon. The men behind the plan were a roll call of the new money. The subscribers included Vanderbilts, the banker J.P. Morgan, and the railroad financier Jay Gould. Between them, they controlled an outsized share of the country's wealth. And every one of them had been kept, in one way or another, on the outside of the Academy of Music. That night, they stopped asking to be let in. They formed a company instead. What they came up with was strikingly modern. They would not simply put up a theater, they would sell shares in it. A box in the new house came bundled with 100 shares of stock, each priced at $100. That worked out to $10,000 for a seat, a third of what Vanderbilt had once offered the Academy, except this time the money would actually be welcome. Buy the shares, and the box was yours, season after season. Within days, the list of subscribers had climbed toward 60 families. The old families had taken a generation to settle who held their 18 boxes. The new house filled most of its list in a matter of weeks. I find it almost too neat. Shut out by an aristocracy, these men did the most American thing imaginable. They incorporated. They took a seat near the top of society, something the old families treated as untouchable, and turned it into a thing you could buy outright, the way you might buy a railroad bond. There was a colder logic underneath it as well. The old house drew its power from scarcity. Only 18 boxes existed, so each one meant everything. The new company went straight at that weakness. It would offer dozens of boxes, room for everyone the old guard had refused, and then some. Where the downtown crowd traded on keeping people out, the Metropolitan would trade on letting the right people in. Abundance, it turned out, could be its own kind of power. The old guard saw the threat coming. August Belmont, the banker who ran the academy, tried to head the whole thing off. He offered to add 26 new boxes to the 18 the house already had, enough, on paper, to give the newcomers a place at last. It failed, and the reason it failed says everything. The boxes Belmont was offering would have been the lesser ones, set apart from the prime tier the old families kept for themselves. Sitting in the building had never been the point. The point was to sit where it counted, in full view, as equals. A second-class box was only a more polite version of the same rejection. They told Belmont no. By now the project had real money behind it and real momentum. The men leading it made a choice that was a statement in itself. They would not build downtown beside the academy on the old family's ground. They picked a site far uptown, on Broadway between 39th and 40th Streets. It sat well north of 14th Street, close to the new mansions rising along Fifth Avenue. That choice was a quiet act of defiance. For decades, the city's social heart had been anchored downtown. The opera men were betting they could pull it north, toward their own front doors, and dare the old guard to follow them onto strange ground. The sums were already huge, and they would only climb. The founders did not blink. They had been told to their faces that no fortune could buy them a place among the city's elite. So they set out to prove the opposite, on a scale nobody had ever attempted, in clear view of the very people who had turned them away. Downtown, the old families carried on with their season as though nothing had changed. Their 18 boxes were intact. Their world still felt secure. They had no idea that a few miles uptown, the men they had brushed aside were already moving on the house that would unseat them. Chapter 3: Building the Warehouse. The man they hired to build their showpiece opera house had never, in his whole life, set foot in a theater. His name was Josiah Cleveland Cady, and he reportedly took a strange pride in that fact. He was a respected architect of churches, and he had worked on a wing of the city's Natural History Museum. Solid, serious buildings. never a stage. When the opera men offered him the commission, the story goes that he admitted he had never once attended a performance. They handed him the job anyway. What he gave them did not look like a palace. From the street, the new Metropolitan Opera House was a blunt block of yellow brick that loomed over Broadway like a factory. New Yorkers took one look and pinned a nickname on it that never came off. They called it the Warehouse. The unkinder ones said it looked like a brewery, and yet it was enormous. The finished house could hold more than 3,000 people, a giant by the standards of the day. Inside, the trouble ran deeper than the facade. The stage was cramped. The space behind it was tight and clumsy. From the first season, the working parts of the theater were judged poorly designed, and a good many seats stared straight into an obstructed view. For a house built to present the finest singing in the country, it was, in plain terms, a poor place to watch an opera. Critics noticed all of it. They marveled at the size and rolled their eyes at the design. But the men who built it were not troubled by any of that, and the layout shows why. The boxes, the ring where the families would sit and be seen, claimed the best positions in the house. The stage, where the actual art took place, got what was left. The building was made for the audience to look at one another. The opera was almost the backdrop. Then there was the cost. The first estimate came in at $600,000. That number did not survive contact with reality. Almost every part of the project ran over. By early 1882, the bill had pushed past $1.5 million, and the stockholders met to decide whether to keep going. They voted 8-3 to press on. Every few months the cost climbed again, and every few months they agreed to pay it. By opening night, the total sat at around $1.7 million, the equivalent of roughly $50 million today. They kept signing the checks because stopping was unthinkable. They had promised the city something no one had built before, and walking that back would have looked like surrender. Pride, once committed on that scale, has no brakes. To run the house, the company brought in Henry Abbey, a seasoned theater manager who loved a big occasion. Abbey spent on the opening as though nothing short of perfection would do. His boldest stroke was to land the celebrated Swedish soprano Christine Nilsson, reportedly for $2,000 a night. She had been singing for the rival camp downtown. Now she belonged to the Metropolitan, and Nilsson was only the start. Abbey put together a whole company of imported stars, each one costly, each one a signal that the new house would settle for nothing less than the finest. This is the part of the story I always stop on. Abbey's free spending made the opening possible, and it was the very thing that would come back to haunt the house. None of them could see it yet. The house was finished. The talent was signed. All that was left was to open the doors and prove in front of all of New York that they had been right all along. A date was set. October 22nd, 1883. Chapter 4, The Night of Two Operas. In the weeks before that October night, fashionable New York faced a question it had never quite faced before. Not what to wear, where to go. For the first time, the city had two opera houses opening on the very same evening. One was the Old Academy of Music, downtown on 14th Street. The other was the brand new Metropolitan, uptown on Broadway. To pick one was to pick a side, and everyone who mattered understood that. A newspaper of the day joked that deciding where to go had become as hard, that season, as deciding what to wear. I would give a lot to have stood on the sidewalk that night and watched the carriages arrive. By the appointed hour, Broadway near 39th Street had jammed solid with broughams and hansoms, the line of arrivals stretching back for blocks. Crowds gathered along the curb just to watch the famous step down, craning for a look at the diamonds. The crush grew so thick that the Metropolitan held its curtain for more than half an hour, simply waiting for the boxes to fill. The performance paused for the audience. Inside, the great curve of boxes blazed with gaslight, and the light caught a fortune in jewels. By one estimate of the day, the wealth gathered in those boxes came to more than $500 million, the better part of the country's greatest fortunes packed into a single room. The families sat shoulder to shoulder, draped in diamonds, more aware of one another than of anything happening below. When the curtain finally rose, it rose on Gounod's Faust. The role of Marguerite belonged to Christine Nilsson, the soprano Abby had crossed an ocean and emptied a budget to bring over. Her voice filled the awkward, oversized room, and for a few minutes the building's flaws did not matter. She gave the new house its first great performance, and she gave it to an audience that had, in plain truth, paid more to see each other than to hear her. Downtown, the old guard answered the only way it could. The Academy opened that same night in its freshly redecorated house, and its draw was Adelina Patti, a singer the whole city knew by name, and the families downtown had adored for years. Patti against Nilsson, downtown against uptown, old money against new. For one night, the rivalry had two faces and two stages, so the city split. Some stayed loyal to the Academy. Others hurried uptown to the new house, drawn by curiosity, or ambition, or both. And a few of the most determined did something that tells the whole story of that evening. They went to both. They sat through part of one performance, climbed back into their carriages, and raced the 25 blocks across town to appear at the other. Picture that for a moment, men and women in full evening dress, shuttling between two opera houses on a cold October night. Perhaps they could not bear to miss either one. Perhaps they could not afford, socially, to be caught at only a single house. Either way, they spent the evening making sure the right people saw them in both rooms. By morning, the verdict was plain. The new house had been packed, brilliant, and on every tongue in the city. The men who had been told that no fortune could buy them a place at the top had answered with an evening so overwhelming, the whole town was still talking about it the next day. They had not waited for permission. They had taken the stage and dared the old families to look away. It looked like total victory. It was not. One triumphant night is not the same as a lasting win, and the new house was about to learn the difference. Chapter 5. The Cost of Winning. The difference had a number, about $600,000. That was what the new house lost in its very first season. $600,000 in 1884. The equivalent of roughly $18 million today. Gone in a single year, almost before the place had found its feet. How does a house that full lose that much? The answer was built into the place from the start, and it came in two parts. The first was the spending. Abby had brought over a whole company of stars and paid them like royalty, and the rivalry only made it worse. With two opera houses chasing the same small pool of famous voices, fees climbed to heights no box office could ever earn back. The other house was paying its leading soprano even more than the Metropolitan paid Nilsson. Both sides were bleeding for the privilege of having the biggest names, and neither could stop, because stopping meant letting the other win. The second part of the answer was quieter and easy to overlook. The families owned their boxes outright. They had bought them with shares, not tickets, which meant the seats that the entire rivalry had been about brought in nothing at the door. The opera men had built a theater where its wealthiest patrons never paid to get in, so the arithmetic was upside down from the first night. The costs sat at the ceiling. The richest seats earned zero. Everything the house spent on those productions had to come out of whatever was left, and whatever was left was never close to enough. Set the losses beside the building, and it looked worse still. They had spent close to $2 million to put the house up. Now it shed another $600,000 every season it stayed open. The triumph was turning into a hole with no bottom. I almost feel for Henry Abbey. He had given the city a night it would not forget, and it destroyed him. Under the terms of his deal, Abbey personally carried the losses, and his share came to something like $250,000. He had handed New York its dream evening and gone broke paying for it. After a single season, he was finished. He walked away from the house he had filled with imported voices and left the founders holding a beautiful, ruinous problem. The house had cost a fortune to build. Now it lost a fortune to run. This was the strange truth underneath all the diamonds. These men had built a monument to a single idea that money could buy anything they were refused, and the monument could not pay for itself. The house meant to display their fortunes had started quietly, to swallow them. The founders now faced a question they had never thought to ask. How do you keep a palace like this open without being ruined by it? The answer, when it finally came, would be the last thing these men expected. To keep their house of wealth alive, they would have to fill it with something the boxes barely understood. Chapter 6: A Temple to Wagner. The way out was almost insulting in its simplicity. If imported Italian stars were bankrupting the house, then the house would do without them. In 1884, the company handed the stage to Leopold Damrosch, a German conductor, and Damrosch changed everything. Out went the ruinously expensive Italian singers. In came an all-German company, performing German works, and above all the operas of Richard Wagner. The money made immediate sense. A resident German company cost a fraction of what a parade of imported divas had demanded. The endless, ruinous fees were simply gone. The house even cut its ticket prices, and still the seats filled. The change was drastic, and it worked. For the first time, the new Metropolitan was close to paying its own way. But the rescue came with a twist. The men who built the house had wanted glamour, short, melodic Italian opera, famous voices in beautiful costumes, the kind of evening you could dress for and follow without effort. What they got instead was Wagner. Wagner was the opposite of all that. His operas ran 4 hours and longer. They were dense and serious, thick with myth and weighty themes, and sung in German. The critics raved. Many of the families in the boxes, draped in their diamonds, dozed. They had come for an evening out, not for 4 hours of German philosophy set to music. Picture it. People who had spent a fortune to build a stage for themselves now sat through long German epics they could barely follow, many of them nodding off in seats that had cost them dearly. The house that opened as a showcase for jewels and pretty tunes had become, inside of a year, a temple of serious art. The German years had their own losses. Leopold Damrosch died suddenly in 1885, in the thick of the work. His young son Walter stepped up to keep it going, and the company brought in Anton Seidel, a conductor who had worked directly under Wagner himself. He had stood at the master's side at Bayreuth. The era lasted 7 years, and under men like Seidel, the Metropolitan grew into a serious Wagner house, admired far beyond New York. Nothing in this whole story delights me quite as much as this. These men set out to build a monument to themselves, a stage for their own wealth and rank. Scrambling only to keep the doors open, they accidentally built a house. The opera world took seriously, devoted to exactly the kind of demanding art most of them had never asked for. Money and pride had raised the building. What gave it weight in the end was an art form its owners had not wanted in the first place. The new house had found a way to live. It had become something its founders never planned, and it had survived. Downtown, the old Academy of Music had no such second act. Facing the same merciless math with no reinvention left in it, the old house was running out of time. Chapter 7: The Fall of the Academy. In the end, the contest between the two houses was never decided by who had the finer singers. It was decided by who could afford to lose money, and only one side could. Downtown, the Academy of Music carried on under Colonel James Henry Mapleson, a showman of real nerve and real flair. He had run glamorous Italian opera there for years, with the old families firmly on his side. His great asset was Adelina Patti, a name that could fill any house in the world, and a fee to match. Patti commanded $5,000 a performance, the equivalent of well over $100,000 a night today. She would not sing until she had been paid in cash before the curtain rose. Mapleson liked to claim she kept a parrot trained to screech one word before a show: cash. Patti was a tremendous draw, and a ruinous expense. To keep her, and to keep pace with the new house uptown, the colonel had to spend at a level no manager could hold for long. Prestige, it turned out, does not pay the bills. And here was what he could not get around. The men who ran the Metropolitan could lose $600,000 in a season and simply write another check. Mapleson could not. He was one man, spending money he often did not have, against a syndicate of the richest men in America. The same money trap that had ruined Abbey was now closing on the Academy. The difference was that the old house had no one standing behind it to absorb the loss. The way the story is told, he admitted the plain truth. He could not outspend Wall Street. By 1886, the Academy had given up opera altogether. A year later, Mapleson was bankrupt. What stays with me is that the side with the better stars still lost. He had Patty. He had decades of prestige, and the loyalty of the old families. None of it was enough, because the other side could keep losing money until he broke first. The opera house the newcomers had built as a weapon had done exactly what it was built to do. The war was over. The old guard had lost it. The fall, when it came, was not gentle. The house that had once turned away the richest man in America was reduced to booking vaudeville. The popular variety shows the old families would once have thought beneath them. The proud stage of the aristocracy now belonged to jugglers and comic songs. The building lingered for decades after that, a faded relic of a world that had moved uptown without it. In 1926, it was torn down. The wreckers came, and the city barely paused to notice. The old house that had begun the whole quarrel by turning away a single box was gone. Uptown, the new house had won everything that mattered, but it was not done being tested. The hardest blow it would ever take was still ahead, and it would arrive without a moment's warning. Chapter 8. The Night It Burned. By the early 1890s, the worst finally seemed to be behind the new house. The German experiment had run its course, and Italian opera was back on the stage. The books were under control. After a decade of crisis and reinvention, the Metropolitan looked for the first time like a settled institution. And then, on a quiet summer morning, it burned. On the 27th of August, 1892, fire broke out inside the Metropolitan Opera House. By one account, it began with a dropped cigarette in the rooms where the painted scenery was stored. The timing, at least, was merciful. It was the off-season. The house was all but empty, and no audience sat in the boxes that morning. But the flames moved fast, and they were savage. Smoke rolled over the rooftops, and crowds gathered in the streets below to watch the new opera house burn. Firefighters worked for hours. By the time they had the blaze out, the inside of the building was a blackened shell. The auditorium that had opened with such fanfare 9 years earlier was gone. The stage, the seats, the famous tier of boxes, all of it ruined. The opera men had sunk a fortune into the place, and in a single morning most of what they had built was ash. The outer walls still stood, but the house the city had known was finished. The fire forced a hard choice: walk away or rebuild. Some of the original investors took the disaster as their moment to leave. William Rockefeller was among those who cashed out and did not come back. After everything they had poured into the dream, the sight of the gutted house was enough to make a few of them quit for good. But the heart of the group stayed, and what they did next is the reason the Metropolitan became the house people would picture for generations. They did not patch the old interior back together. They brought in the well-known architects Carrere and Hastings and told them to rebuild the inside from the ground up. What rose out of the ruins was a different building behind the same brick walls. Gone was the plain, cramped room that Katie had designed and that critics had mocked. In its place came a deep interior of red and gold, richer and warmer than anything the house had held before. Over the stage, carved into the arch above it, went the names of 6 composers: Beethoven, Gluck, Gounod, Mozart, Verdi, and Wagner. The house that had once looked like a factory now looked like a palace. Carving those 6 names over the stage was a kind of declaration. After everything, the house wanted to be remembered for its music, not only for the money sitting in its boxes. The work took a full year. The house went dark for an entire season, and when it reopened in 1893, the change was complete. The rebuild reshaped who owned the place too. The number of private ownership boxes was cut sharply, down to about 35, all of them on the prime tier. The fire had sorted the committed from the rest. What remained was a hard core of the founding fortunes, and the house that held them was now far finer than the one they had lost. I have always thought the fire did them a favor. The original house had been an embarrassment, a plain box that critics had laughed at from the start. The fire erased it and handed the founders a second chance to build something worthy of the fortunes inside. It took a catastrophe to make them get it right. When the doors opened again, the building was no longer the warehouse. It was a deep red and gold room that finally matched the wealth seated within it. And in that gleaming new house, the spectacle the whole rivalry had been about was about to reach its height. Chapter 9: The Diamond Horseshoe. By the turn of the century, the boxes had earned a nickname that stuck. The newspapers called them the Diamond Horseshoe for the jewels the women wore each night, a long band of diamonds curving around the auditorium. This was the payoff. Everything the founders had set out to do, the snub, the rival house, the fortune spent, the fire, and the rebuilding, had led to this one place. The Diamond Horseshoe had become the throne room of American society. A seat there was no longer just a box at the opera, it was a position in the hierarchy of an entire country. And it had a queen. Her name was Caroline Astor, and she ruled from box number 7. Mrs. Astor was old money, a knickerbocker of the oldest kind, and her presence in the new house told you how completely the old division had healed. The families who had once guarded their 18 boxes had not been wiped out. They had simply joined the winners. Old money and new money had fused into a single aristocracy, and the opera box that had started the whole quarrel was now its shared throne. Her reign came with rules, and everyone obeyed them. She arrived at 9 o'clock every time, no matter when the curtain had gone up. No one in the Diamond Horseshoe dared leave before she did. Monday nights were the great nights, when the boxes filled and the women's jewels competed for attention as fiercely as anything on the stage. Mrs. Astor wore diamonds said to have once belonged to Marie Antoinette herself. When she rose to go, the night was effectively over, and the boxes emptied behind her. I have to keep reminding myself that none of this was a joke to them. These were grown adults, people of immense fortune, and they arranged their whole social lives around who sat in which box, who arrived when, and who dared to leave before whom. To them it was deadly serious. It was the line between mattering and not. The rules reached well beyond the opera house. In 1888, a social arbiter named Ward McAllister told a newspaper that there were only about 400 people in all of New York who truly counted. The 400, the city called them. It was popularly said that the number came from the capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom, though that story has been picked apart in the years since. When McAllister finally published an actual list, it held closer to 319 names. The point either way was the same. A line had been drawn, and almost everyone in America stood on the wrong side of it. And here is the irony at the heart of all of it. The new money had built this house because the old families had shut them out of a closed and exclusive circle. Now, a generation later, they had built a closed and exclusive circle of their own, with its own rules, its own list, and its own queen. The outsiders had not torn down the gate. They had become the people who decided who came through it. The obsession reached almost comic heights. At one point, the interior was repainted, the pale walls traded for deep gold and maroon, because the lighter color was thought to dull the women's jewels. The new colors, the story goes, were the Astor colors. The house was being decorated, in other words, to flatter the audience rather than the art. And the music itself was at a height to match. The great tenor Enrico Caruso sang in that house in these years, and the world's great singers came to perform on its stage. This was the summit. The boxes were full of diamonds and old names. The leading families of the country watched one another across the auditorium, and a single woman in a single box presided over all of it. It was everything the founders had imagined on the night they walked out on the academy. And yet the world that filled those boxes was already beginning to fade. Chapter 10. The Weapon Falls. All of it faded. The world that had filled the Diamond Horseshoe, the rigid order, the Queens, the 400, slipped away over the decades that followed. And in the end, so did the house itself. The first real sign came in 1940. The era of the family-owned boxes, the whole reason the place had been built, came to an end. Ownership passed from the wealthy families to a non-profit association. Many of the private boxes were pulled out and replaced with ordinary seats, open to anyone who could buy a ticket. For the first time since the house opened, a stranger could sit where the founding families had once held court. The throne room was turning into an ordinary theater. By the 1960s, the building's age had caught up with it. The cramped stage that Katie had designed back in 1883, the flaw the founders had never cared about, had become a real problem. Modern productions needed more room, better machinery, a deeper stage. And so John D. Rockefeller III and the city builder Robert Moses pushed the Metropolitan to leave its old home and move uptown into a new arts complex called Lincoln Center. The decision to go was also a decision to abandon the old house. And almost at once, a campaign sprang up to save it. It was bitter. On one side stood preservationists, artists, and ordinary New Yorkers who could not stand to lose the building. At the farewell gala in 1966, the conductor Leopold Stokowski stood before the audience and pleaded with them to help save the place. On the other side stood the Metropolitan's own management, who wanted it gone. They feared that if the old house survived, a rival opera company might move in and compete with them. The people who had inherited the house were the ones most determined to see it destroyed. It came down to a single vote. The city's Landmarks Commission voted on whether to protect the building, and the measure failed, 6 votes to 5. 1 vote. The Metropolitan then sued to clear the way for demolition, and won. The house that had survived a fire and 70 years of changing fashion would not survive its own owners. By the end of 1966, the effort to save it was finished. In January of 1967, the wreckers came. The house where American opera had grown up, the building 2 generations of New Yorkers had loved, was pulled down. It was the first great loss the city suffered after finally passing a law to protect its landmarks only 2 years earlier. It joined the original Penn Station, torn down in 1963, as a lasting symbol of everything New York had thrown away in the name of progress. And so the weapon fell. The opera house the new money had built to punish the old families had done everything it was meant to do. It had won its war. It had outlived the very world it was built to rule. And then, 1 vote short of rescue, it was gone. Today an office tower stands on the site. Nothing there hints that this was once the social heart of the country, where its great families argued over who sat where, and where a woman in diamonds could rule an entire society from a single box. If there is a lesson in all of it, I think it is this. The men who built that house set out to prove that money could buy anything. In the end, it bought them a social order that dissolved, and a building that did not last. Nothing they made survived. Not the rules, not the rank, not even the walls. The snub that started the whole thing is long forgotten now, but the question underneath it, who really runs a city, and who gets to decide, has never really gone away.